Welcome to another video about a problem that is driving people absolutely bananas. Today we're talking about shrinkflation.
If you feel like your favorite products are getting smaller, it's because they are.
Family size, large size.
68, 69, 70.
The cookies are shrinking.
Companies are out here gaslighting us.
I'm fed up. You ever go for the last chip in the Dorito bag and suddenly say, whoa?
They're advertising as if, hey, you're going to get this great value.
And it's not true.
It's not fair. It needs to be regulated, and it needs to be regulated now.
This shrinkflation stuff is getting out of control.
Me hate shrinkflation. Me cookies are getting smaller.
Shrinkflation.
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 Politicians are arguing, TikTokers are up in arms, and even the Cookie Monster has issued a statement regarding shrinkflation. It's reported that 71% of Americans have experienced or noticed instances of shrinkflation. And I don't know about you, but I am definitely part of that statistic. Bags of chips seem lighter, toilet paper seems to run out faster, chocolate bars look suspiciously thinner, and so much more. What the heck is going on here? Well, like always, I am determined to find out. Why are products seemingly shrinking? What actually is shrinkflation? How did we get here? Who is to blame? What's being done about this? What can consumers do about it? And more. Let's dive in.
So today, as you can tell, we're reacting to this video on shrinkflation. Now, after the last video, we're talking about grocery prices, how ridiculous it's getting. So I thought, what a perfect video to react to than Zachary's shrinkflation video. The link to that will be in the description if you just want to watch that full video. But we will be reacting to it today. And also, I just want to give you guys one example that I think was genius. So I don't know if it's in the US, but there's Terry's chocolate orange, which is like an orange chocolate, but it's shaped like an orange. But basically, they used to be 175 grams, and they changed it to 157. I think is always really funny because they just flipped the 7 and the 5 so that people wouldn't kind of notice. But yeah, anyways, let's get straight into the video.
They say size doesn't matter, but history and shrinkflation prove otherwise. The textbook definition of shrinkflation is when companies reduce the size, quantity, or quality of their products while keeping the prices the same. While the news, the internet, and the whole wide world might make it seem like a brand new phenomenon, it's actually far from it. Believe it or not, the concept of shrinkflation dates back to 13th century England. In medieval England, the size of bread was one of the most widely enforced statutes of its time. The law regulated the price, weight, and quality of bread to protect consumers and ensure bakers didn't exploit fluctuating grain prices. Essentially, the principle dictated that a unit loaf of bread would be sold at a constant price to maintain fair access to staple foods even during times of economic hardship. But because of this mandate, when the market price of grain or rye increased, bakers had to reduce the size of their loaves of bread to maintain the regulated price. An early example of shrinkflation driven by economic necessity.
Just the UK and EU just over-regulating. Once again, unbelievable. But what I want to know is, how do you measure like the quality? Like the size and stuff I understand, but how can you keep it same quality?
Crazy, huh? Over the years, much like in medieval England, society has continued to grapple with producers decreasing product sizes while maintaining the same price in various forms. So why does this suddenly seem like a hot new topic? Well, for a few reasons. First, back in the 13th century, these were usually small-town bakers just adjusting the size of their bread out of necessity. Now it's big, massive companies doing the same thing, and it's up for debate whether they're acting out of necessity or simply chasing corporate profits.
Yeah, this is something a lot of people commented on my last video. Like, a lot of it initially was to compensate for how high inflation has been recently, right? That has been high. But the problem lies where a lot of corporations just kind of latched on that and just took it to its extreme. So people were like, you know, okay, inflation is going up, shrinkflation is coming in, that's fine. But then when you increase prices by like 30-40%, or you reduce the size of something by 20-30%, when inflation was like maybe 9-10% at its most, you can see it's clearly just for corporate greed again. And like I've replied to a few of the comments as well, is stock prices, right? Just look at those. They're still at all-time highs. The economy is struggling. The everyday person is struggling, whether it's tax or trying to find a job, cost of living. We're struggling. But the companies conveniently are doing well.
but we'll cover that later. The second reason this is a hot topic is because of the internet, baby. The internet has brought this issue to the forefront. As societies become more online, we've also become more informed consumers. Subreddits, TikToks, and even entire websites exist dedicated to outlining instances of companies shrinking product sizes. A couple hundred years ago, you couldn't take pictures of Doritos bags, post them online, and compare sizes. But now you can. And with the rise of modern consumerism, we needed a term to describe this economic phenomenon. Enter shrinkflation. Coined by British economist Pippa Milgram and added to Merriam-Webster's dictionary in 2022, the term is everywhere, and so are its effects. From household staples like toilet paper rolls mysteriously losing a few sheets to chocolates quietly shredding a square or two, today's shrinkflation has become a widespread consumer frustration. Household paper products have shrunk while their prices have shot up 35%.
Yeah, that's the other thing. Sorry, so it's not even just maybe the price goes up or the size stays, or, you know, if the size is reduced, okay, at least the same price. No, they do both. They reduce the size on one hand and they increase the price. That is corporate greed.
Cleaning supplies, same story. Smaller bottles, but prices up 24.5%. Even canned fruits and veggies are pulling a disappearing act, with prices climbing 23.7%.
That's actually so true. That's what I really noticed. Canned vegetables and stuff, they used to be so ridiculously cheap, and they've gotten so expensive. I swear, like a tin of beans used to be like 20p, which is like 25 cents. And now like it's always like over £1. It's so expensive.
Now sure, it's normal for the prices of consumer goods to rise over time. Generally speaking, inflation drives up the cost of things like raw ingredients and transportation. However, when higher prices are combined with shrinking product sizes, it's becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And on top of all this, topics like shrinkflation and the economy have become deeply politicized. It's harder than ever to sift through the noise and figure out what's really going on as a consumer.
Oh no, not a
Okay, now back to it. So as consumer goods continue to shrink in size while prices increase or remain the same, frustration among shoppers is reaching an all-time high, leaving many of us asking the same question. Why? Why are companies resorting to this tactic? Well, the answer, as it turns out, is a bit more complicated than it seems. At its core, shrinkflation is a response to economic pressures. Companies have faced rising costs for raw materials, labor, transportation, and more. There's no denying that. So businesses have been scrambling for ways to cope. And that's where things like shrinkflation come into play. Instead of directly raising prices, companies give you less for the same amount of money. And there's psychology behind why they do this. A 2004 Harvard study found that consumers are more sensitive to price hikes than subtle changes in product size.
I mean, that makes sense, but that's because you're also not like blatantly telling you. Like, imagine if you went into the shop and it just said, okay, this 100 grams of whatever was 120. I think people would definitely be a bit more prone to not liking it if they blatantly knew it, but they're more so just hoping people don't realize, right?
And this makes sense, right? You're more likely to notice if a candy bar jumps from $1 to $1.25 than if it quietly shrinks by 10%. Well, companies realized this and took the ball and ran with it. And ran, and ran, and ran. Take a look at this. Typically, when rising costs for raw materials, labor, and transportation squeeze corporate margins, we expect those margins to shrink, something we've observed consistently over the past 30 years. But in recent years, when these costs rose, something surprising happened. Corporate margins shot up.
This is one of the best graphs I've ever seen. Oh, the profit margin is flying up.
Way up. So despite higher costs, companies have record high profits. Why? Well, this is highly up for debate. Many are accusing some of the world's biggest companies of what's being dubbed greedflation, or extreme profiteering. They argue that corporations, particularly in developed economies like the US and UK, have used rising raw material costs, inflation, the war in Ukraine, and other global events as convenient excuses to raise prices while expanding profit margins to unprecedented levels. And there are studies, data points, and experts who back this claim.
Yeah, I mean, it's all true, and it just goes over everything again. Like, your salary will, like, stays the same or barely goes up in comparison to all these increases. It really just is. It's like they mask it with inflation, but really it's just corporate greed and their profits are flying. And like I said, and I'll say it again, stock market is rallying, and with good reason, because these companies are making money. They're not struggling.
2023, the largest review to date on greedflation, examined 1,300 companies across 4 continents. It concluded that while supply chain bottlenecks and the war in Ukraine contributed to price hikes, companies' profits surged at a much faster rate than costs. In fact, profits for companies in major economies like the US, UK, Europe, Brazil, and South Africa jumped 30% from 2019 to 2023, vastly outpacing inflation. Additionally, the nonprofit Accountable.us found that many of the largest general consumer S&P 500 companies have admitted to benefiting from increased prices as their net profits increased year over year. Another study done this past year from the Groundwork Collaborative found that despite corporations experiencing rising labor and input costs, they've been able to maintain and even expand their profit margins to levels well above historic norms. This trend has also alarmed many economists. Albert Edwards, a top veteran strategist with 4 decades in finance, called the current levels of corporate greedflation unprecedented and astonishing, adding, quote, "This cannot be ignored, and if this trend doesn't change, we may be looking at the end of capitalism."
Not the end of capitalism, but I do think it can lead to like a crash of some sorts, because like everything breaks at a certain point, and as it is at the moment, the salaries are so low, rents keep going up, and like if the cost of all these things keeps going up, eventually like it will break. What you're seeing a lot as well is people are using credit cards more. It's like super high utilization of credit cards. I think potentially the highest in history. So you have that, and like eventually people are going to start defaulting on these loans because everything's going up. The interest rate on everything is going up. The cost of everything is going up. So people are just going to collapse under it, and then it'll be a domino effect. And I guess that'll lead to them eventually reducing prices and some sort of market crash. It's not a good direction to be in.
Pretty bold words. That said, with the study,
and the other thing is, like we were looking at groceries, like at the end of the day, people have to buy food to eat, you know? So it's not like you can just be like, okay, I'm just not going to buy it anymore. Same with rent. It's not like you can just be, okay, I'm just not going to go rent a place anymore and be homeless. That's just not an option.
Data points, and bold claims to support these arguments, economists lack a general consensus on inflation, shrinkflation, and greedflation. In fact, some argue that greedflation isn't real, claiming it's just business as usual. Corporations driven by shareholder interests are inherently greedy. That's not a unique phenomenon. It's simply how the free market and modern economy operates. No matter where you stand on the issue, whether you view shrinkflation as a natural occurrence of inflation, or you believe it's something a little bit more sinister, it's impossible to ignore its impact either way. Personally, I find myself somewhere in the middle. On one hand, many legitimate businesses have undoubtedly faced rising costs and reduced product sizes out of necessity. On the other hand, it's hard to deny that some corporations have exploited this environment to take advantage of consumers.
Take Kraft Heinz, for example. Kraft Heinz is a billion-dollar business, and it's a company frequently criticized for shrinking product sizes, especially in North America. In Canada, items like salad dressing bottles have shrunk from 475 milliliters to 425 milliliters. The same goes for Classico tomato sauce, which dropped from 650 milliliters to 600 milliliters. In the US, Kraft Heinz seems to be shrinking fewer products outright, but they're engaging in something arguably more deceptive. Kraft is altering ingredients and removing items from products.
This is the one I was hoping this was going to get touched on. Yeah, a lot of companies as well are just changing their product fundamentally, making it worse, lowering the quality of it. I think that's worse than shrinkflation. At least with shrinkflation, it's like, okay, I know I'm getting a smaller amount. Or regular inflation, I'm getting the same product, but it's a bit more expensive. But to just change the ingredients and stuff like that, honestly, I think that should be illegal without some sort of label. That a product, especially that's been on the market for so long, changing its ingredients, should have to be flagged somewhere.
products, a practice some refer to as skimpflation. For instance, Kraft owns Lunchables, and over the years the protein in their pizza kits have quietly dropped from 16 grams to just 14 grams. Now, the reason many point out Kraft as a company that's potentially exploited this environment to take advantage of consumers is because they are market leaders. They're one of the largest food and beverage companies globally, with annual revenue in the tens of billions of dollars. To put it simply, they're not hurting for money, and across their wide range of products, they've quietly downsized portions or altered product ingredients, leaving customers paying the same for less. But
yeah, it's not a great example of like where it's like fake competition when like certain companies own dozens and dozens of brands, like Kraft Heinz, you got PepsiCo, Coca-Cola Company. All of these actually own so many different brands, and they have complete market domination.
But you know what's crazy and really makes you think? Listen to some of these responses companies give when people ask about these changes. Last fall, Tropicana redesigned its classic bottle, removing 6 ounces, and a spokesperson for Tropicana Brands Group told CNN that the change was made to address customer feedback, claiming the new bottle makes the orange juice easier to pour. Heinz said something equally ridiculous last spring with their beans. They reduced the amount in a 415-gram tin from 51% to 50% beans, and stated the reasoning was to make it taste better. A few years ago, General Mills cut the size of its family-size cereal boxes from 19.3 ounces to 18.1 ounces. When asked about this by NPR, they claimed this change allows for more efficient truck loading, which is important in
Truck loading, that's insane. But yeah, General Mills, another example of a company that owns like 50 different brands.
both reducing global emissions and offsetting increased costs associated with inflation. Here's one of my personal favorites though. A few years ago, when a spokesperson for Charmin was confronted by reporters from WBUR about shrinking the size of their toilet paper squares, they suggested it was a result of, quote, innovations that allow customers essentially to wipe more efficiently. I mean, seriously, how dumb do these corporations think we are? Wipe more efficiently? What a joke. If a company is generally facing supply chain bottlenecks or higher input costs, just be honest about it. Stop pretending like you are doing this because of the environment or some random new toilet paper innovation. And I think that's what makes all of this so frustrating. The lack of transparency and the disconnect between businesses and consumers. In today's world, image is everything. When you're shoving ads down our face and acting like you suddenly discovered a new way humans can wipe their butt, plus increased your pricing, plus started giving us less, it's a slap in the face. But that's just the business perspective. You'd think there'd be some laws to protect consumers against things like shrinkflation and deceptive marketing practices, right?
I love the US Eagle noise, it always gets me.
Right? Right? Well, some countries like Brazil, France.
Now, to be fair, like, it is weird because sometimes I think regulation has definitely like killed the UK and Europe's economy, and it's allowed the US to be so dominant, right? Their regulation is quite lenient and it's a good business environment, but there definitely has to be balance because it's getting pretty ridiculous.
France and South Korea have rolled out rules requiring companies to clearly label or warn consumers about product size.
Oh wow, so it's kind of what I said. Yeah, if there was actually like a sign that says it's changed, that's interesting. That's pretty cool.
Or amount changes. In France earlier this year, they announced a decree requiring retailers to signal to consumers when a food or consumer product has undergone shrinkflation, an attempt to bring awareness to the issue. In South Korea, food manufacturers and suppliers can even face fines of up to $7,300 if they fail to notify buyers of size reductions. It's too early to tell if
$1,300. What, to the whole company or like per something? That is not a big fine if it's just like a one-off fine.
these changes have made a significant impact, but they seem like steps in the right direction. Here in America, however, the legality of shrinkflation is harder to pin down. In the US, non-functional slack fill is prohibited unless it serves an appropriate purpose. Slack fill is legally defined as the difference between the actual capacity of a container and the volume of product inside. So when you open a bag of chips and find mostly air, that could be categorized as non-functional slack fill. And believe it or not, it's illegal. However, proving what constitutes non-functional slack fill is challenging, as many companies argue that the empty space is necessary. Plus, in the US, producers are required to already indicate the amount of volume, weight, or quantity of their products on their packaging labels. As a result, many instances of shrinkflation, such as slack fill, aren't currently viewed as fraud or misrepresentation. And as I mentioned earlier,
that's a really interesting point. I didn't even think about the empty space and
shrinkflation has become such a big issue here in the States, it has officially entered the political ring. Pennsylvania Senator Bob Casey recently launched a campaign and introduced a bill. Yes, an actual bill called the Shrinkflation Prevention Act of 2024. The legislation aims to give the FTC the authority to investigate and crack down on shady corporate practices like price gouging and deceptive product downsizing. While the intention is noble, not everyone is on board. Critics argue that without shrinkflation, prices would simply rise outright, making everyday products unaffordable for many. They point out, at least with shrinkflation, people can still buy these items, even if they're getting less for their money. Then there are centrists who are—
But like, fundamentally, why is anybody in a first world country that's working full-time struggling to buy grocery food items? You know, let's think about that for a second. It's because the wages are just too low, because these companies aren't paying what they should in wages, never mind all this stuff.
Argue that businesses should be allowed to increase prices as they see fit, but if they do, it needs to be clear and obvious to the consumer. Ban these deceptive practices and actually enforce the law as it's written. As I mentioned earlier, there are already some fragments of laws that could apply to these situations, but there's a big difference between having laws on the books and actually enforcing them. Personally, I do think legislation like this could help, but if there's one thing I learned, it's that waiting for the government to save the day usually doesn't work. Real change tends to come from us, the everyday people. When consumers unite and demand better, companies have no choice but to listen. And that's where public shaming comes into play. I'm serious. Bringing awareness to this issue and voicing your complaints has seemingly worked when it comes to fighting shrinkflation. Take Toblerone, for example. Back in 2014, they reduced the weight of their bars by 25% by increasing the gaps between their signature chocolate triangles. People weren't having it, and everyone—
Yeah, that was so funny, but that was also just so obvious as well. Like, and it just ruined the whole look and shape and taste of the bar. Like, it was a terrible idea. They should have just made it shorter if they were gonna do that.
Started complaining about it online. After getting called out, Toblerone actually reversed the change and brought back the original design. Then there's Chipotle, which I exposed in a documentary last spring. As I and many others called out the skimping, Chipotle's CEO eventually admitted they were cutting corners. He promised to fix it, and guess what? It's reported portion sizes started to improve. These are perfect examples of how when companies mess with us consumers, loud and collective outrage can actually—
Like, to a degree, that's correct, but notice how both the examples are what I would call like the luxury items, you know what I mean? Like, it's not milk, it's not like chicken or something that like you do have to buy. Like, you don't have to buy a Toblerone, you don't have to go to Chipotle. It's those everyday items that you really can't go without.
Make a difference. And I think that's the takeaway. Yeah, we're paying more and getting less, but that doesn't mean we should just roll over and accept it. If you spot shrinkflation or any deceptive marketing practices, call it out, post about it online. Follow consumer advocates who are trying to hold these companies accountable. There's a fantastic website run by consumer advocate Edgar Dworsky, who has become the go-to expert on shrinkflation. His site, mouseprint.org, serves as a hub for informed shoppers to track product shrinkage. I highly recommend checking it out along with his socials. And finally, if you can, vote with your wallet. Stop buying brands that are pulling these stunts. I know that's easier said than done, but when companies see sales decline, change seems to happen. If enough people say no, they're forced to listen. So if there's one thing you take away from the video, I hope it's that. Don't stay silent. As always, thank you so much for watching.
So yeah, really good video, as always, from Zachary. Incredible YouTuber. Make sure you guys check him out. But yeah, overall, shrinkflation, I guess it's just going to continue, you know, for now. I'm glad to see some countries are kind of regulating it. I would love to see that maybe in the UK and the US, but we'll see. Overall, just try and, you know, vote with your wallet, like Zachary said. Definitely a really good option. And hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.